Welcome back to the Fit Minute Podcast, Fitness for Real People, with your host, Gabrielle Mazar. On today's episode, Gabrielle interviews Ed Daube, the emotions doctor. After 32 years working for the California Youth Authority as a psychologist, Ed used his knowledge to develop the emotions as a tool model. He teaches people how to strategically deploy emotions as tools to improve their lives and their relationships. And now here's your host, personal trainer and stretch therapist, Gabrielle Mazar.
Welcome back to the Fit Minute Podcast, Fitness for Real People. I am your host, Gabby Mazar, and on today's episode, I have Ed Daube, the emotions doctor. Welcome to the show today.
Well, thank you for having me, Gabby. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So let's get started by, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? What exactly is the emotions doctor, and what are emotions according to you and you as the emotions doctor?
Well, I'm retired now after some 32 years working for the California Youth Authority. And it's always interesting to me how I became the emotions doctor. Let me kind of give you a little bit of the background. When I was doing my internship here in California to become a psychologist, I wanted to do a segment, if you will, with a treatment center, an alcoholic treatment center called Henry Olaf House in San Francisco. And I went to the man who ran it, was my neighbor, and I asked him if I could sit in on one of his meetings. And he said, no. I said, well, why not? He said, you can't sit in, but what you can do is you can be a participant observer. And I thought, piece of cake, no problem. Here I am, I'm just about ready to get my Ph.D. I don't have a drug problem. I don't use drugs, don't use anything. I don't drink really. So it's no problem. It took these folks 6 months, Gabby, to make me realize they called me a non-drinking alcoholic. And what I mean by that is that they dealt or attempted to get away from their emotions by drinking and using drugs. And I got away from my emotions by going into my books. So we were both of us were avoiding emotions. I was just doing it differently. So I get my doctorate and I get my first job with the California Youth Authority. And now I'm dealing with young women, all of whom have serious issues, emotional issues, abuse issues. They've committed serious crimes, and I have to try and help them understand what emotions are and how to deal with them. I had no language, because my language was up here in academics and theirs was down here, often less than a high school education. So I developed the emotions as tools model, which I'll get into. I also had to deal with jaded correctional staff who didn't want to deal with their own emotions, let alone with the emotions of all these young women. So I had to help them understand what emotions were as well. Now, they knew how to use handcuffs, and they know how to use their batons, and they knew how to use their tools, but they didn't know how to deal with emotions. That's where emotions as tools came in. So I developed
your book, Emotions as Tools, is your book.
Emotions as Tools,
Yeah.
which I wrote once I retired. I wrote that book in order to help people understand what emotions are, because in our culture, we tend to deny our emotions. Men are socialized. Now, I just take a step back. I just had a visit with my two young grandsons. One's 1 and the other is 3. They are very comfortable with their emotions. But as we grow and we develop, men are basically socialized. You express anger as a man, I can express it, but I don't do well with anxiety or sadness. A few years ago, I went on to a LinkedIn, it was a forum, and it was a women's forum. And I said, I'm a man, what happens when you as a woman express anger? 2,000 women came back and told me, we can't express anger because when we do, we get demeaned, we get marginalized, we get put down. So the display rules for women in anger are very different. So I wrote the book, Beyond Anger Management, in order to help people understand, men and women, what anger is and how to use it. My goal is to help people, men and women, reclaim their emotions. So here's how it works. We are born with primary emotions, 5 of them: mad, sad, glad, fear, and disgust and surprise. That we're inbred. Now, when we were cave people, we needed these emotions to help us survive because we don't have claws, we don't have sharp teeth, but we do have our emotions. And we are hardwired, and this was mentioned in that earlier interview that you and I spoke about. We are hardwired to experience these emotions. Now, we're constantly scanning our surroundings for threat. When we were cave people, all threats were survival based. And our emotions prepare us subconsciously to deal with these threats. Our emotions are, we perceive threat, we perceive the emotion, we're set up physically to react to that emotion. Now, it's that emotional reaction that happens subconsciously that gives rise to the myth that our emotions control us. They don't. Our emotions cause that initial subconscious physical reaction. Now, as we've evolved as humans, we've evolved our thinking ability, which is the cerebral cortex. That gives us the ability to look at the situation, to assess the situation, and then to make a choice on how we want to react. So when you look at the emotional mastery cycle, the first is to become aware that you're experiencing an emotion. The second part of that is to create safety. Now, this is real important in terms of dealing with emotions. And what I mean by create safety is to take a deep breath, and that lowers your emotional arousal. And then to take a step back from the situation. That creates physical safety if you're in a situation where you're dealing with somebody else or whatever it happens to be. The third step is to assess what's going on. What am I feeling? How does what I'm feeling match my situation? Are there other things going on that maybe I'm not seeing? So is there a misinterpretation here? And then the fourth step is to choose a response. Now, when you master your emotions as strategic tools, it empowers you to do several things. First of all, it empowers you to control your situation. You're not controlling your emotion, you're using the emotion. It enables you to deal more effectively with other people. And if you will, in terms of physical health, you can avoid going into things like catastrophizing or acting out inappropriately with your anger. You are now controlling your situation, but using your emotions to inform you of how you perceive what's going on, and gives you the opportunity then to make a decision on how you want to most effectively deal with that situation.
So, what is the difference between mastering your emotions and controlling your emotions?
Good question. The only part where controlling your emotion comes in is where you control your physical reaction. You take a deep breath and you take a step back. When you try and control your emotion, what you're trying to do is you're trying to repress that emotion, push it down, not feel it. And that never works. I mean, it works for a minute or two, but
Right.
the emotion comes back. When you master your emotion, you are using that emotion to improve your own life and your relationships with other people. So what you're saying here is, let's take a different example. Let's take a look at your cell phone. Now, maybe you're real good with your cell phone. I'm not. I'm still
I don't think
very much,
most people are.
I'm still
I
very
mean,
much,
people are good with cell phones, but they use them
exactly.
way too much.
Right. But it's a tool, Gabby. And if you think of it as a tool, then you master the parts of that tool that you need to use. I'm very good at using my cell phone to take verbal memos. So when I get an idea for a new blog post or whatever, I speak it into my phone if I'm wherever I happen to be, and then I can recapture it. I can make phone calls. So I'm using that as a tool.
Okay.
When you master your emotions as tools, now you're not trying to control it, you're experiencing it. It's not controlling you, if you will, which is also a myth. But the idea here is it's giving you information. Excuse me. Your emotion is giving you information, and you're using that information to interact more effectively with your environment. That's the difference between control, which is putting down that emotion, and mastering it and using the information. And that's all emotions, by the way. There's another myth out there that there are good and bad emotions. There are not. When we try and take what we call a bad emotion, such as anger, and it's called bad, by the way, because people tend to act out and do negative things when they get angry. Sadness is considered a bad emotion. It isn't, and I'll tell you why in a minute here. So there are no good or bad emotions. They're all adaptive. Now, there are positive emotions in the sense that they feel good, and there are negative emotions in that they feel bad. The challenge with labeling emotion as negative, it implies we want to get rid of it. We don't. If you've lost something, whether it's a person or whatever it happens to be, you're going to feel sad. In the case of losing a family member or a pet, your sadness now, I'm sorry, I got a little bit of congestion here. Your sadness informs you, you need to take a step back. You need to allow yourself to grieve. And once you've done that, then you can begin to move forward again. Sadness is an important emotion. Let's take a look at anger. I mentioned earlier about women and anger. Now, if you as a woman understand that your anger is always valid, doesn't mean it's always appropriate, but it's always valid, then you can say, okay, what is it that I'm angry about? And what do I need to do about it? Because the message of anger is I perceive a threat. Now, my suggestion to these women on LinkedIn was to take that anger and use the energy of that anger to motivate you to make a plan. You may not be able to express your anger directly as anger, but you can take that anger, keep it inside, and use the energy to develop a plan to then deal with the threat. So that's how you master your anger as a strategic tool. You don't directly express it because it may be dangerous to do that, but you can use the energy of that anger to propel you forward to make a plan of action to deal with the situation in which you find yourself.
So let's go back to we discussed my previous podcast from Happy for No Reason, and talking about different types of anxiety that cause the different emotions and how we can use that as a tool. Can you talk a little bit more about that and why they're different and why one is different than the other?
Yes, good question. The message of anxiety is a future-based emotion. And the message of anxiety is there may be a threat out there, and that threat may be dangerous to me or may cause me some harm. Now, if you catastrophize with anxiety, and catastrophizing is taking a situation and projecting it into a future as if the worst possible outcome can happen, and reacting to that worst possible outcome as if it's the only possibility. When you catastrophize, you go down a rabbit hole.
Which I think most people do. I think most people catastrophize a lot of situations and not necessarily just one. They're not just thinking of one thing. It's probably a dozen terrible things that could happen. And going back to how we've evolved, our minds go a lot faster now when we have our phones and social media and all of these things. So we're looking at something that makes us think 20 steps ahead.
Yep.
To give us that anxiety. But there are positive ways to use your anxiety as well.
Yes. And here's how you deal with that. When you experience anxiety, however you experience it, for me, I experience it as a churning in my stomach. When I feel anxiety and I recognize anxiety, what I do is what I recommend for all emotions, and you need to practice this because it's developing a skill. And as you know, if you're going to develop a skill, you have to practice it till it becomes automatic. Otherwise, it may not be there when you need it. So I take a deep breath, which lowers my emotional arousal. I take a physical step back from the situation, and I ask myself, what's going on here? What am I actually looking at? So if my anxiety tells me there may be a threat, I say, what's the threat? If the threat for my students happens to be an upcoming exam, what action do I need to take? I need to study. If I'm looking at an interview, an upcoming interview for a job, for example, and I'm nervous about how I'm going to present myself, I need to prepare myself as much as I can. So when I do that now, I'm using anxiety as eustress, E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S. Anxiety as distress, D-I-S-S-T-R-E-S-S, is what you talked about earlier. That's catastrophizing. It's not taking action because I'm worried what might happen. Can I get it? How am I going to do? And I get into all these what ifs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, once you take the proper steps that you can, now you experience the flip side of anxiety. And the flip side of anxiety is anticipation. Anticipation is a future-based emotion, the message of which is there's an upcoming event and there's a real good chance I'm going to do well in that event. So if I have prepared myself for the interview, now I'm looking forward to that interview because I'm ready. It's like, bring it on. So that's how you use your anxiety as a strategic tool. You identify the emotion and it's informing you of a possible future event. You look at the event, you say, what do I need to do to prepare for that event? You prepare for that event, and now you move into anticipation and you're looking forward to it. It doesn't mean you're not nervous. You may still be a little nervous, but you're approaching the event differently.
So you worked with incarcerated women for how many years?
30 years.
30 years. And that led you, when you retired, to write your books. What exactly did you experience with these women and what you saw working with them that led you to find things that you needed to kind of shed a light on with emotions in retirement that you felt were important?
Okay. When I first started working at the Youth Authority, I had 5 young women on my caseload, all of whom had killed their children. I was totally unprepared for that. I never came across that in graduate school. There were no courses that said, how do you deal with these kinds of issues? So now I'm being faced with these young women, and what they're depressed, they're suicidal, they're angry, they're acting out, and they have absolutely no clue how to deal with these kinds of feelings. The first thing I needed to do was to help them understand that while what they did was monstrous, they themselves were not monsters. Now, your viewers may be tempted to say, well, wait a minute, how can you say they weren't monsters? And without going into a whole lot of detail, in every situation, what they did was a result of the situations in which they found themselves and in which they were living and their own abuse. Now, I'm not justifying the behavior. I never justified the behavior. What they did was absolutely wrong. But what I needed to help them understand was that what they were feeling, whether it was the anxiety, whether it was the depression, whether it was feeling suicidal, all of those emotions were valid emotions. They needed to understand what those emotions were. They needed to understand that, yes, it was okay to be angry about how they were treated. They needed to understand that, yes, it was okay that they were feeling sad and feeling depressed, but it wasn't okay to stay there. And when they understood what emotions were as tools, now they could then use that information to begin to grow and move beyond where they were psychologically. And it was very, very powerful. And so then that is what set up the whole thing, the whole idea of emotions as tools, which led me to write the book once I retired, because I found that there's just one of the deficits of our culture, and we do a lot of good things in our culture, but one of the things we totally miss, we don't teach people what emotions are and how to deal with them. Yeah. So then we leave people vulnerable to their emotions and the emotions of others, by the way. Because I wrote a blog post, what do you do when somebody directs their anger at you? And we don't learn how to do that. So not only do we need to manage our own emotions or master, but we need to learn how to master the emotions of others as well, because how people interact with us affects us. So if we're not prepared for that, we then may take on the emotions of others and blame ourselves. LinkedIn just asked me to respond to a question. How do you get beyond dealing with a toxic boss? And when you have a toxic boss, that toxicity tends to infect you. And the way to get past that was what I was writing, was to use forgiveness, which you may think is kind of strange. Why do I want to forgive somebody who's abusing me? But let me explain. Forgiveness is a process. Forgiveness doesn't mean that I let you off the hook. And this is something else that I needed to explain to my young women. They needed to forgive their abusers. They needed to forgive their rapists. And they said to me, well, Dr. Daube, I'm not going to forgive him because he did bad things to me. And I said, you're absolutely right. But forgiveness is not for him. It's for you.
Right.
When you forgive somebody, what you're saying is, I'm done with you. I'm cutting all emotional ties with you. I am freeing myself to move past you. So what I was suggesting to toxic bosses is forgive them so that they can no longer emotionally impact you. And I also said, and this probably is going to be somewhat controversial, they needed to forgive themselves. I said, well, why? Well, when you forgive yourself, you're not forgiving yourself for doing anything wrong. You're forgiving yourself for getting involved with this person. So what you're doing is you're saying, okay, I'm done. I'm relieving myself of responsibility, if you will, of having gotten involved with this person, the toxic boss, the rapist, whatever it happens to be. And when you do that, same process, you now allow yourself, give yourself permission to grow and move on.
It's interesting because you said something about before we talked about toxic bosses and about someone treating you poorly, but just a toxic boss in general too. But when someone is taking out their anger on you or taking out their emotions on you, it's not you, it's them. It is their emotion that they are putting onto you. You are just the target. You just happen to be. So it's not necessarily something you did or you making them mad or you doing anything wrong at all. It's them and what they are battling with. So when you forgive them, it's your reaction to whatever they are doing that allows you to be free of your emotions in that situation.
Yes.
And I recently have been having this kind of issue with myself because I've been letting some things make me really, really upset. And I had this conversation with my dad. I said, Dad, I'm just tired of being mad. I'm tired of being mad about this. And he said, it's your own fault. It's your fault you're mad. You're the one that is allowing yourself to be upset about this because they're going to do whatever they're going to do, but you want to be mad about it because you're continuing to hold on to something that's making you upset, but you're reacting this way. It's your reaction. And he's right. It's my reaction that's allowing me to become inflammatory. I mean, not that I but within myself, and that's not me at all. I'm very, I let a lot of things go, and I do very much try to master my emotions because I do understand that whatever's going on with people around me, it's not whatever I did to them. Maybe it is sometimes, but majority of the time it's whatever's going on in somebody else's life that's causing them to be upset about something. And whatever the situation is, I'm allowing it to get to me and I'm allowing myself to react in a way that I don't like.
Yes, but let me interject here. The first step, Gabby, as I would say, is take a look at your anger and ask yourself, what is the threat to which I'm reacting? Because there may indeed be a real threat, whatever that threat happens to be. Somebody has taken advantage of you. Somebody has, whatever it happens to be.
Sure.
Once you acknowledge the threat, now you can say, how do I want to deal with that threat? And it may be that you want to get rid of your anger or you want to use your anger.
Right.
Now, I also write about what I call the basic relationship rule. And when you're in a relationship with somebody, sometimes you still want them in your life, but you don't understand why they're doing what they're doing. So the basic relationship rule says all of us in every situation do the best we can, not the best possible, but the best we can, given two things. The first is their model of the world, and the second is their skill sets. Now, if we understand that, we then can look at the behavior that the person is manifesting towards us and say, what is the model of the world? How do they see me? How do they see our situation? Because maybe their inappropriate behavior is being elicited by a misperception of their interactions with you. Again, doesn't justify it, but it helps understand it. But if the model's correct, then maybe there's a skill set deficit. So let's say, for example, that they're angry at you, and they're angry at you because of something that they think that you've done, but they don't know how to say to you, Gabby, I'm angry at you because you did such and such. They lack that skill set. Now, if you know that, you then can come back and say, I understand that you're angry with me. What is it that I may have done that led you to see me this way? So what you're doing now is you're compensating for and teaching them how to interact with you. So if you understand, you look at a person's model. Now, you don't have to do this with everybody.
Right.
You do this with the people that are important to you. If it's a toxic boss, you may have to do it with them. I don't know. If
I'm the boss, so I can't fire myself.
Exactly.
I could have this conversation with myself.
Right. But it gives you a way to approach the situation. Now, what you've done there is you've used your anger as a strategic tool to inform you of how you perceive the situation with the other person. You've now used what I call the basic relationship rule. It's probably not a correct name for it, but it's the best I've got at this point, to look at their model of the world and their skill sets. And now you're in a position to choose what intervention you want to use to correct the situation in which you find yourself. That's how it all fits together.
Right. So you have your two books, Emotions as Tools, and then you have Beyond Anger Management. We touched a little bit on Emotions as Tools. Can you tell us a little bit more about Beyond Anger Management and what that book is about?
Yes. This is Emotions as Tools, by the way.
Okay.
It's available on Amazon, and this is Beyond Anger Management.
Okay.
Now, here's what happened with that book. I retired, wrote my first book, and several years later, I began to read about people dealing with anger, and that they went through anger management programs and they didn't work. In fact, I have the son of a cousin of mine. I'm not quite sure what you'd call him, but he has had problems with anger most of his adult life. And he went through anger management programs and they didn't work. And the reason that they don't work is because what you find in anger management is they're telling you to control your anger. They're not telling you to use your anger. And so I wrote Beyond Anger Management, Master Your Anger as a Strategic Tool. And the idea here was the same thing. Sometimes anger is appropriate. Now, you may act out on it differently, and sometimes your anger isn't valid for whatever happens to be. It's sometimes called a secondary emotion. And this is another myth, by the way, because anger, writers tend to define anger as always a secondary emotion. It's not. Sometimes anger is very appropriate. But for men, we tend to, if we feel sad or anxious or an emotion that we don't feel comfortable with, then we act out in anger.
Aggressively.
Right, and aggressively. And I saw articles where you would see celebrities saying, well, you know, if she hadn't done such and such, I wouldn't have beat her up, which is garbage.
Right.
Exactly. So I wrote my Beyond Anger Management because I wanted then people to reclaim their anger and to be able to use it when it was appropriate, but not use it as an excuse in order to justify their bad behavior.
Yeah, we saw that recently. What was it? The Golden Globes with Will Smith and Chris
With Will
Rock.
Smith. That's exactly correct.
Yeah, absolutely not the way to
Nope.
use your anger in any way, shape, or form. But
Now, he may have been very appropriate to be angry. I'm still not clear on that, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt that he was.
sure. To
Right.
be angry, yes.
But
But
not to act
how he
out
expressed
aggressively.
it, yes.
That's
Right.
exactly correct.
Absolutely. So your website is the Emotions Doctor, spelled out doctor.
Yeah,
Um,
TheEmotionsDoctor. Yes.
okay.
.com.
And then your books, you can get to your books on from your website also, but you can find them on Amazon, the Emotions as Tools and Beyond Anger Management. Is there anything else you would like to leave our listeners with today?
Yes, I would. I would really appreciate it if you went and bought my books, but that is not my critical focus here.
Okay.
And let me say why. My blog has a great deal of information on it. And the best way to access that blog, and it's free, by the way, is to go to the website, and on the home page, on the upper left-hand corner, there is an index tab. When you click on the index tab, it pulls down, and you now have access by category to all of my posts. You click on the category, it will take you to all the posts in that category, let's say on anger, and you can one-click access directly to that post. I would direct your viewers to my blog. There's a ton of useful information there. If you want to know about any emotion, go there, educate yourself, and you'll get the information in most cases for what you need.
Yeah, and let people know that emotions are okay. It's okay to feel
Exactly.
emotions. It's okay to have them and to express them and to use them, but not to use them in a negative way. We want to
That's
try and
exactly
use them for positive and use them in the way they were meant to be used, not to cause us or other people harm.
right. To simply use your emotions as tools to inform you of how you are perceiving your environment, and to give you the opportunity to assess whether or not you've perceived it correctly. Because sometimes you may be mistaken.
Yeah.
You may misperceive what someone says to you. So once you then acknowledge the information your emotions are providing for you, you can then choose how you want to respond. And when you make that choice, you are now empowered to both take back control of your life and to impact your relationships more effectively.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Ed, for coming on the show. You can find you'll find his website and his links to the books in the show notes, theemotionsdoctor.com. We really appreciate all of your information today, Ed.
Thanks, Gabby. I've enjoyed it. It's been fun.
Thank you. Yes, thank you everyone for listening, and we will see you all next week.
Thank you so much for listening to the Fit Minute Podcast, Fitness for Real People, with your host, Gabrielle Mazar. If you would like more information on today's episode, you can find it in the show notes and on Gabrielle's website at www.destinationfitcations.com. Visit to keep an eye out for upcoming fitcations. Be sure to share the show, give this podcast a review, and subscribe so you won't miss an episode. Join us next week to hear more stories from people just like you. This has been the Fit Minute Podcast, Fitness for Real People, with Gabrielle Mazar.